Jordan, lovely to see you. Thank you for your time today. You've spoken about trying to tilt the world towards heaven and away from hell. Are you saying that we're headed to hell in a handcart? And is the decline of Western civilization reversible, do you think?
Well, those always exist as possibilities, and we all know that in our own lives, because you know that things can go badly or they can go well. And you also know that you have some relationship with that, because you know that if you continue the pattern of dreadful mistakes that you're inclined to make, that you could stop making if you wanted to, that things could get very bad for you and likely have at different points in your life. And so those realities are always set out ahead of us. And the notion of heaven and hell are you could think about those notions as the ultimate reaches of those possibilities. And we never fully inhabit an archetypal hell, but I would say Auschwitz came close.
Yes.
It was close enough for me. And then with regard to heaven, well, you inhabit that now and then. When I think the easiest pathway to what's meant classically by heaven is often to be found in love, especially in relationship with children.
Yes.
You see, when I had, my wife and I had my daughter, we lived in a pretty poor area in Montreal, and we used to push her around in a cart, and as you do with babies. And one of the wonderful things to see was that even the roughest street guys you could see the best in them. If they weren't completely obliterated by their lives, you could see them light up. And that light, well, that's, the ultimate extension of that light is heaven. And we make choices that move us in one direction or the other all the time. And the way that society unrolls itself is a consequence of those choices, and in a much more direct way than people tend to think. So, are we doomed to an apocalyptic nightmare? No more than we have been in the past, although perhaps faster now because of the rate of technological transformation. I don't think it's ever the case that things have to move in a hellish direction, but they sure could.
But life feels a bit hellish at the moment if you think about the war in Ukraine, recent events in Israel. We've had a lot of divisiveness on the streets of London in recent days and weeks. Do you think that there's a way of reversing the sort of tribalism associated with, say, identity politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're experimenting with how to do that on a large scale this week here in London, so at the conference that's occurring around us. And do I think it's possible to reverse it? I think it's always possible to reverse it. I mean, look, Russia dumped the Soviet Union, and maybe you're not very happy with Russia at the moment, but they did decide that totalitarian experiment was inappropriate. We locked ourselves down miserably for 2 years, absolutely pointlessly, toying with totalitarianism, copying China, in essence, very rapidly. But we decided that maybe that wasn't such a good idea and backed off. And so I don't think things are ever set so miserably that there's no hope. And certainly I don't think that's the case with the world right now, because the horizon of opportunity that's in front of us is at least as vast as the horizon of catastrophe. And I would say vaster, because I think in the final analysis, good triumphs over evil. I think it's more powerful in the final analysis, that truth is more powerful than falsehood, virtually by definition.
Although we do live in this post-truth world. I mean, we've seen around some of the debate around Israel this week of people perpetuating falsehoods. We also live in this society now where the prevailing attitude is, if you don't agree with me, then you're not just wrong, but you're a bigot and a racist and deserve to be cancelled.
Or worse.
Or worse. So I think there's a perception that Western governments particularly have been weak on woke. They've been weak on the so-called tolerants who are actually extremely intolerant. How does the silent majority cope with this?
Well, usually, too often, perhaps by putting their head in the sand. I mean, that's certainly the case in my country, because it's taken multiple dismal turns for the worst in the last 8 years. But the Liberals there were led by a very charismatic leader who's extraordinarily narcissistic and who's used compassion. Look, if you're really narcissistic and manipulative, the best disguise is compassion. And you can get very good at acting that out. And if you're very good at it, it's very hard to stand against you, because your constant excuse is, well, I'm just doing this for the good of someone else, and not only for the good of someone else, but for the good of the most oppressed and suffering.
Yes.
You know, and if you're good at that, it's very hard to, first of all, it's very hard to be suspicious enough to actually detect the magnitude of that lie. And second, it's hard to stand against it without easily being tarred and feathered as a bigot. You know, when I first came to some political trouble, let's say in Canada, in 2016, I spoke up against a bill that I thought was an unwarranted intrusion into the realm of free speech and free thought, which is what it was, but it was guised in the cloak of, well, we're just caring for the least of the lesser, who was in this case people confused about their sexuality and their gender, trans people, let's say, and the immediate accusation towards me was that I was hateful and a bigot. Well, you know, it's, why did you choose this hill to die on? Why don't you care about these poor suffering people? Can't you just use the language that would make them feel better? And then if you are also, you know, why are the governments weak on that sort of thing? Look, I talk to conservatives and classic liberals all over the Western world, individual by individual. And although this is starting to change to some degree, they're all terrified of being torn apart by the bloodthirsty mob. And no wonder.
But then that suggests that politicians may have lost their courage. And I'm wondering what your analysis is of Rishi Sunak's...
No, the mob just got more effective.
Well, maybe. But you've met with some Conservative MPs this week.
Yeah.
I mean, has Rishi Sunak's conservatism lost its way?
Well, he inherited a mess, to be fair. And how Boris Johnson got enticed down the net zero road is just beyond me. I think it probably had something to do with his young wife, you know. But he swallowed hook, line, and sinker the apocalyptic narrative that implied that the only way forward into the future was to decimate poor people and to make energy more polluting and 10 times as expensive, which is rather a preposterous plan, as we can see by how it's laid itself out in the UK and even more stunningly in Germany. And poor Sunak's in a position where he has to go, that looks like it was a mistake, which isn't really a glorious vision of leadership. And I don't really know what he's supposed to do with that mess. Now, what he's been doing is rolling it back to some degree, and you might say perhaps not fast enough, and I suppose I would incline to agree with that, but by the same token, I'm glad I'm not in his shoes. What the conference here this week was designed to suggest, at least in part, was a broader vision than the mere vision of, oops, it looks like we made a mistake on the energy and environment front.
Although there are some Conservative voices, you've just touched on this in this interview, who feel like they are mooted. You know, you hear Miriam Cates or Danny Kruger talk about the value of family, and then there are people waiting in the wings to clamp down on that. You're being sexist, you're being derogatory towards women by referencing their role in a family. You've been scapegoated by the left, some could argue, once described, I think, as, how was it, a pseudo-intellectual hero to the incel community.
That was a pretty good line, that one.
But what's your reaction to those sorts of criticisms, which must be very hurtful?
Well, they were hurtful for a good while, but after a while they just sort of became comical because they just got more and more absurd. Look, every category has an ideal at the center and a margin at the fringe. And if the center is destroyed, the margin will be demolished as well. Now, the radicals think that you can bring the margin to the center, but that's preposterous because a margin is a plurality. And if you bring the plurality to the center, you demolish everything. You demolish the category. Well, look, if you have the nuclear family as the minimal ideal, obviously you simultaneously exclude to some degree those people who aren't in that constellation. But if you destroy the constellation itself, everyone disappears. So I'll give you an example. So we had LGB and then we had LGBT. Well, now the T is destroying the L and the G. And the reason for that is that the margin will devour itself. And so it might be the case that my pro-family stance marginalizes, but it's even more the case that the stance that says any old thing goes destroys absolutely everything. And you're naive to think that that's not the case. And I think that what's happening, 80% of the kids who undergo, at least before this recent explosive epidemic on the female side, 80% of the kids who are undergoing gender transformation surgery unnecessarily are gay. Right, well, that's a classic stellar example of what happens when the margin takes the center. The margin can't take the center. Now, so that brings up a real problem, which the leftists point out to, is like, how do you have a category, say with the family, the nuclear family as the minimal ideal, without being prejudiced against other people? And it's something like an informed and humble tolerance. You know, like, there's divorce in my immediate family, you know, and certainly in my extended family. My sister's been divorced, my brother's been divorced, my daughter's been divorced. Every family has people in it who are single or who are widowed, or who are in gay relationships. I mean, the family is an ideal that's breached more than it's adhered to, but that doesn't mean you get to sacrifice the ideal.
No.
The ideal still has to stay. And then we have to live with the tension between the ideal and the fragments that surround it that actually make up, well, even if you're in a dedicated marriage. I mean, there's been times in my marriage with my wife where our relationship was very tense. And so we moved away from the ideal, but you don't throw out the ideal just because it's difficult to attain and because it excludes what's not ideal, because then you destroy everything. If you have no ideal, there's nothing to work for. And the notion that we can somehow move beyond the minimal nuclear family, I just don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. And I would also say that when contemplating that, we might want to look at those who are truly the most vulnerable and victimized, and the ones who are most vulnerable and victimized by the breakdown of the nuclear family are 100% children. It's plain and absolutely simple. Children without fathers, for example, do way worse. And that if the evidence that's been accrued on that side isn't convincing to you, then no evidence about anything ever would be convincing about anything.
Although the alternative view to that would be that you are stigmatizing single mothers by saying that, because actually you could have an extremely...
I am stigmatizing single mothers.
Is that a problem, though, if you have
Well,
a strong and
it's a
empowered
problem.
woman who is bringing up
Yeah.
a family in the absence of a father who actually maybe their absence is welcome, maybe the dad wasn't a good influence? You'd arguably be better off with the strong mother than two weak parents.
Well, there's obviously exceptional cases
Sure.
where the exception is the preferable alternative.
Yeah.
Obviously. Well, that's the decision that people make when they get divorced. You know, most people who get divorced aren't happy with it, but they accept the broken marriage as the reality that's preferable to the continuation of the relationship. And I've certainly had couples, for example, or people in my clinical practice for whom the divorce was clearly the right alternative. And they were married to people who were narcissistically psychopathic, who were making their lives absolute hell. But that doesn't mean that you get to escape from the ideal without the price of stigmatization. You can do a good job as a single mother, but that doesn't make it an ideal. Certainly not a societal ideal.
You mentioning narcissism again. I mean, do we think that individualism has turned into narcissism and that there is a greater prevalence of narcissism in today's society?
Jean Twenge has made that case. She's quite a good social personality psychologist.
I mean, you've described Trudeau as a narcissist. Would you describe, for instance, Harry and Meghan as narcissists?
I have to tread lightly with such categorization, being a clinical psychologist.
Well,
you know, I'll leave myself to speculation. Well, Twenge is the best source on this, and she believes, and I think there's some truth in this, is that the hyper-emphasis, for example, on the development of self-esteem at all costs in the education system, which was a pathology generated by the faculties of education, you know, damn their hides, has produced a generation of young people who are tilted more in a narcissistic direction. And this constant insistence that you can define yourself, you know, independent of all social relationships whatsoever, and that you should pursue what's hedonistically desirable at every second, come what may. Well, all of that's by definition narcissistic.
Yes.
So, but I think mostly what it's produced, though, probably more than a what would you say, epidemic of narcissism, is that it's produced an epidemic of depression and anxiety. And Jonathan Haidt right now is writing about that. He's a famous personality and social psychologist, and a very good one. And he's documenting evidence. He spoke at this conference here this week. He's documented evidence that the typical liberal identifying young woman in the United States is statistically more likely to have been diagnosed with a mental illness than less likely.
Yes.
So it's the majority. It's particularly hitting young liberal women hard. And so is that a narcissism? I think mostly it's manifesting itself in an excess of misery. There's some narcissism as well. You probably have to be tilted that way to begin
Yes.
with, though, you know.
Can I just ask you about multiculturalism?
Yeah.
Because we have witnessed some extraordinary scenes on the streets of London.
Yeah.
We've had the call for an intifada from London to Gaza. We've got a huge amount of division at the moment between some sectors of the Muslim community and Jews.
Yeah.
We've seen an uplift in Islamophobia and in anti-Semitism in recent times. Does that suggest that multiculturalism has failed?
Well, there was no such thing as multicultural philosophy. It's so puerile and moralizing and unsophisticated that it's kind of a miracle of stupidity. I mean, first of all, we've always had a multicultural world. That's why there's been wars, right? So along with multiculturalism goes wars when the cultures don't get along. So what happens when you import that? Well, two things. You either import that under a unifying rubric, which would be something like the melting pot in the United States, or you retain the multicultural divisions. Okay, and you might say, well, we benefit from the diversity, which is arguably true, you know. I mean, when I came to London in the 1980s, I went to a reasonably good restaurant and I was fed canned spaghetti. You know, the food here was, to call it dismal was an absolute compliment. And so one of the benefits of multiculturalism has been a radical diversification, let's say, in cuisine, and that's a huge benefit. But if you think you can import multitude of cultures without a unifying rubric and not import the problem of interpersonal and social conflict, you're either blind or stupid or both. And both's a dreadful combination. So, like, on what basis does multiculturalism become peace? You wave some magic wand and all of a sudden everybody gives up their cultural differences and can live in harmony? Harmony defined by what? Is there some unifying harmony? Well, if there's some unifying harmony, then multiculturalism isn't the solution. It's like unity through diversity, you know, peace through war. You know, it's a preposterous claim. It's foolish in its extreme. And then when there's tension, like there is in the world now, well, you see the rifts emerge. And why wouldn't they? Especially if you're telling people, you know, adhere to the dictates of your previous culture.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just...
A couple more quick questions, because I know we're pushed for time. Would a Biden or Trump administration next time round be better for the Western world?
I mean, if someone put a gun to my head, I'd pick Trump. If there was
Why?
a gun to my head. Track record. You know, no war under his administration, and he brought in the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
Well, I would be pretty happy with another 4 years of no war and an extension of the Abraham Accords. Does that mean that Trump would be my preferred candidate? No.
Who would be?
I don't know. I'm going to watch and see as things unfold. There's a new entrant into the Democrat race, Dean Phillips.
Yes.
I know Dean a little bit. Dean's
Impressed
quite
by
a
him?
remarkable person. I think he's a good person, and I don't mean that casually. I've had some fairly extensive conversations with Dean. He's a remarkable person, and so we'll see where he goes. I saw the first Republican candidates debate. You know, it was actually a rather impressive slate, and so I know that Mike Pence dropped out. Mike would have run, I think, a very administratively oriented administration. It would have been back to sort of politics as everyday business, which is really what you'd hope for if you had any sense. Vivek Ramaswamy is extremely creative and entrepreneurial, very dynamic. I think it's very interesting to see him in the race. Nikki Haley's, she's a tough cookie, and she's fun to watch. And so, you know, there's some promising candidates on that side. Now, Trump's a formidable force.
Yeah.
And at the moment, he certainly has the upper hand. And I'm not pleased with Biden for a variety of reasons, not least, and this is something particularly salient at the moment. The Saudis, I believe, and I have reason to believe this, I believe they would have signed the Abraham Accords 2 years ago.
Yeah.
If Biden would have been willing to give Trump some credit. And I believe the Democrats didn't pursue Saudi Arabia at that point because it would have been inconvenient to give Trump credit. And so they isolated and alienated him when they could have given him some credit. He might have just ridden off into the sunset if he'd got some credit for what he had done. but they turned him into the monster they needed to fulmigate against, and now they have the monster back. And now we have the situation in Israel,
Yes.
right, where Iran is using Hamas to agitate the Islamic world against Saudi Arabia, essentially. As far as I can tell, that's what's going on.
Yes.
So I'm not very happy with the Biden administration because of that. And I'm also not happy with the Democrat inability to deal with the woke left. You know, when the squad run by AOC was promoting the pro-Hamas demonstrations in New York, the White House spokeswoman did come out and denounce them. That was the first time in years, 6 years, and I've talked to many Democrats, where I actually saw the Democrats draw a line. I've asked 40 Democrats that I've talked to, some on my podcast, when does the left go too far? Not one of them would answer. Not one. Not even Robert Kennedy. He said, I'm not trying to run a divisive campaign. It's like, fair enough, you know, but you could draw a line between you and the communist psychopaths,
Yes.
you know. So,
That would be a good start.
well, hey.
Final question. Which of your 12 rules for life do you think is the most important?
Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Yeah, you know, if people are wondering, even people who labor under the burden of genuine oppression, if they're wondering what they can do to set the world right, one of the things you can do to set the world right that you could do is you could stop lying. By your own judgment of what constitutes a lie. It's somewhat different than telling the truth, you know, because what do you know about the truth? The truth, that's hard, but you could cease to utter words you know to be false. And by doing so, you would cease to tilt things towards hell, right? And that's actually quite the moral accomplishment,
Yes.
and it has a much larger effect than you might think. I've talked literally to thousands, particularly young men, but not only, thousands of young people around the world who've told me that they decided at some point in the last 4 or 5 years to stop lying, and that their lives entirely transformed. And they usually say that in something like a state of shock, because many of them were in dismal and dreadful places and are doing so much better now that they actually can't believe it. So that's a lovely thing to see.
Jordan Peterson, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.